It's been a while since we did a video on vocations. That's mainly because of the activities we've been engaged in with reopening our churches. But I thought it's a good opportunity today to have a little discussion on discerning a vocation as part of our frequently asked questions series. And whatever our calling in life is, whether it's to the married life, the single life, priesthood, or a consecrated life in a religious community, all of us are different, and all of us have different interests and different callings. But one thing we all have in common is our human nature, and we're all called to a final end, a purpose, which is happiness. And we all go through life trying to find happiness. Often we look for happiness in all sorts of things, which might give us fleeting examples of happiness. We might be happy for a while, and then whatever it is that gives us happiness breaks or leaves us or fades or disappoints us in some way, because nothing lasts apart from God. Our happiness, if we're going to be truly content, is to find out what God has in store for us, because God has better in store for us than we had planned for ourselves. And that's a matter of trust in God. We see God as a personal God, not a man in a cloud, not a ridiculous idea of God, but something a lot more satisfying, a lot more intellectually fulfilling, as a God that is behind and sustains everything in existence, a God that is greater than we can possibly imagine, and yet has a personal interest in us and our well-being. And he wants friendship with us. He wants a personal relationship with us. And we can only do that if we find out what he wants for us and we follow that. How do we do that? We have to do that by allowing enough room in our daily lives to listen in prayer to all of those very subtle voices, and watch out for those very subtle signs in our life which direct us. God very rarely knocks us off our horse on the road to Damascus kind of moment. Most of us will experience God in silence, in very subtle, quiet ways. That voice inside ourselves, which doesn't come from us, it comes from God, telling us, directing us through our interests, through our talents, through the relationships and the consolations that we feel, that are distinct and separate from emotions, but sometimes those can guide us as long as we're very careful not to rely on just our feelings. It's a lot more than that. But throughout our lives, we can certainly feel ourselves quite genuinely directed in a particular path. My own particular story, because it's always important and useful, I think, to bring any kind of abstract discussion of a subject down into a personal level. My own story: I studied engineering at university and I worked in the aerospace industry for a good 10 years. But there was always something missing. I enjoyed my job, enjoyed the people I worked with, but there was always something missing. And I definitely felt that I didn't have the same kind of calling to that job as some of my colleagues were, because they were really absolutely suited to it and they're very, very happy. I had this sensation there was something missing, something not quite right, something unresolved. And in 2005, when I was in my mid-20s, as it happened, St. John Paul II, as he is now, died. And the monumental ripples that this caused, really, in my own life and with the funeral and in the church as well. All of the presidents and kings and prime ministers and world leaders were there at the funeral, because of the impact that this man had on the world. His fight against communism in his own country, the personal impact and the encounter that he'd had with many, many people over the years and across the world. And it made me very proud to be a Catholic, and it made me realise that after all this time with the scepticism and the atheism and the faithlessness we see in modern Western society, the church is still there. It's still weathered all of those storms. And if you study history, we realise it's always been the case. The church isn't going anywhere. It has this timeless truth, a timeless witness to offer the world. And again, the death of St. John Paul II was a real sign of that, the importance of the church and the papacy in the modern world. And I was proud, watching all of this unfold, proud to be a Catholic, listening to the Litany of the Saints. I'd never heard the Litany of the Saints before. I was completely detached from my own tradition and from my own heritage. Even though I'd been going to Mass and brought up a Catholic, I suddenly encountered a church which I realised had this connection back to the time of Christ, and that was a real wake-up for me. I didn't know what to do with it. It really affected me in a way that I couldn't really describe. And the real seeds of the idea of being a priest, being impressed by this individual, St. John Paul II, really came in to the fore at that time. And I started asking myself more seriously, could I be a priest? Because this life was so impressive, and it really triggered something, undoubtedly. When I was younger, I used to go on school trips and with family to Coldy Island, to the Abbey there, and to Belmont with school, the Benedictine monastery, and I really appreciated the peace there, and I did see an attraction to that life. So the seeds to some kind of religious life or something were there from much earlier on, but they only became more concrete really when I was in my 20s. And I started, as I say, talking about priesthood and thinking about priesthood. It took several years really running away from it and trying everything else other than that. I really, was really wanted to have the ideal life as I saw it, my own plans. Marriage was a definite, goal or whatever, and all of that, and just a normal life. 2.4 children with a nice picket fence, a nice car, and a house, and an ordinary average life, and what have you. Of course, perfectly fine. But there was something about that experience, that funeral, where I realised that John Paul II, when he was dying, all of the things that would have been going through his head, all the memories, and he had a message to the young people waiting outside in their vigil with their candles outside the Apostolic Palace, that he was grateful and acknowledged their presence there, but all of those thoughts that must have been going through his head, looking back on his life. And I remember thinking, that's what I want for myself. I want a life that is worth living. That my life was lived not just for myself, but in service of a greater good. And that my life made sense, and it was at peace, at harmony, not without problems, not without challenges, but a life that made sense. And that was really the crux of it. That's what triggered it, the sensation of calling. And it didn't go away, even though I ran away from it. And in my career, I decided I wanted to progress. I wanted to do more than I was, because I felt that I was just staying still. So I did a postgraduate degree in engineering, which I had every intention of carrying on with a career in engineering with that. But halfway during that period, I started feeling this emptiness, that this wasn't leading anywhere. It wasn't leading to that feeling that at the end of my life, as an engineer, I would be who I wanted to be, that I felt that God wanted me to be. And that's no disrespect to any of my colleagues who were called to be engineers, and that's their niche, that's their calling. But for me, it became very clear that it wasn't my calling. It might have been for a limited period of time, but that time was over. and it was time now to follow something more fulfilling, something different, more challenging. It wasn't just about that. There was something inside myself that was begging to be listened to. So over time, I got involved with Student Catholic Society, very heavily involved in that, and some of the priests that I met during that time, and the wider experience of the church, and not just a parish back home, because I was living away from the Diocese of Cardiff for a long time, actually. So half of my experience of the church was outside my own diocese, but that broadened my view, and gave me a view of a much wider experience of the church. It introduced me to things that I'd never been introduced to before, the tradition of the church, as much as anything that I had never experienced before. And as I said, at the funeral, the Litany of the Saints, I found it so beautiful and so meaningful and so deep and wonderful. I thought, why have I never heard of this before? Why have I never heard of the Litany of the Saints? Why has nobody taught me this? Why has nobody given me this? And I realised that was just the tip of the iceberg. There were so many other things, the beauty of the church's music and everything else that I'd never heard before, because all I'd had was a particular limited view of Catholicism, which was very much from the late 20th century, and I realised it was so much deeper than that. So I started really seriously thinking about priesthood, and through the examples of the priests that I met, who had a very clear and firm identity of what priesthood was about. They were very solid in terms of their theology, of their orthodoxy, very much with the mind of the church, what the church actually teaches. That, to me, really nourished me. And after a while, I always felt called back to Cardiff. This is where my roots are. I love Cardiff and I love the diocese. I am a Cardiff boy myself, in the city, but I love the diocese. My mother's family comes from the valleys and all the way up to the mining communities up there, and so I've got very deep roots, and I wanted to serve the Archdiocese. So I didn't want to serve where I was in England, and so I contacted the vocations director. Over time, it gave me space and gave me that ability to make sure it was what I wanted without feeling pressured, and that's really important. But I did realise at that point that I also needed to get on with it. And so from when I did send an initial email, I didn't get a response because it went straight into the junk tray. And so I phoned up. I didn't just leave it there. I phoned up. There's got to be a balance between encouragement, but also the space to make sure somebody really is being called. But once I made that initial contact, I just wanted to follow it through. And within a couple of years, I did retreats, I did pilgrimages, I went on World Youth Day and all of that sort of stuff to Madrid. And that just strengthened and reinforced that feeling. And eventually I applied from the initial email, a couple of years of discernment, then straight through, I was sent to Oscott and did my 6 years, 2 philosophy, 4 theology, and was ordained in 2018. I've never looked back, so I've always been very grateful for that, despite its challenges and its annoyances and what have you. But I do recommend to anybody thinking about priesthood, which is the final point of this read, if you do think that you might be called, firstly, priesthood isn't for somebody who is thinking that holy orders is suddenly going to solve all of their problems and make their life better. You need to be coming towards priesthood from a relatively stable position, a stable background of either study or work. If you are happy and successful and well balanced where you are, but it's not enough, and there can be a dissatisfaction, that's fine, with the current job, or something's missing. All of those can be genuine signs, genuine triggers, as some people call it. There's maybe something different that God is calling you to do, and that's fine. Priesthood is not for people who are running away from the world. That is not what priesthood is for. Anybody, or the religious life. The religious life is not a safe haven for people who are running away from the world, because you will find the world in a religious community, you will find it in priesthood. So it won't solve your problems, it won't suddenly make everything right. A sign of vocation is somebody who loves the church, wants to serve, wants to evangelize, wants to help and spread with the mission, hasn't got all the answers, but has the humility to want to learn what the church teaches. Because the church doesn't need people who think that the church has got it wrong and needs to change her teaching. To be Catholic is to think with the mind of the church, to love the church, and to want to faithfully pass on her teachings. So all of those, if those are in place, good signs, might be a vocation there that needs to be tested. So the next step is to contact either a priest that you trust. Doesn't have to be a parish priest. Not everybody clicks with their parish priest. I can appreciate that. So a priest that you trust, a priest whose model of priesthood is solid. It's got a very strong and orthodox sense of identity. Have a chat with that priest. A priest will always be delighted to have a discussion about what priestly life is like, the reality of it, and to support. A good priest will always want to support somebody thinking about priesthood with no strings attached, no pressure. A vocation needs to be free. It's got to be absolute free choice, free discernment. And if you decide it's not for you, then there's no problem. I do sometimes get emails from people who make initial contact and then possibly they think, oh, I made a mistake, it's too early, I shouldn't have done that. There's no reason not to continue with a dialogue with that. I mean, I can understand why people get a little bit shy or feel that they perhaps aren't ready. But there's no harm in just sending an email out or ringing up and saying, look, I might have a vocation, I don't know. Can I talk to you about it? And there's not going to be any obligation, any pressure whatsoever. Just have a little bit of a chat. Why you might think you're being called, what your current situation is. Just give you a little bit of guidance. And I would advise anybody thinking about priesthood not to take too much time over the initial stage. Don't get too hesitant about it. You have to trust. You have to trust God. And even if ordination isn't what God has in store for you, it's still a journey that God may want you to embark on for his own reasons. It may not end up in ordination, but there's a reason for that particular time. So if it does get to a stage where somebody's sent to seminary and they leave during seminary, nothing wrong with that. They go away having learned and become a better person, please God. And often that is the case. They come away from the seminary maybe after 2 or 3 years in goodwill, and they can now then go and apply those things that they've learned and what the experience that they've had in a very beneficial way in a different form of service of the church. Otherwise, at that initial stage, it may be clear from a first year it's not for them. That's fine. There's no pressure, no obligation, no reason not to ask the question. I do encourage anybody who's not sure, who's a bit nervous. There isn't any kind of committal. to anything. You're not signing up to anything. Just have a chat. Just find out a little bit more, and I can find out a little bit more about you in order to help you see more clearly what perhaps might be the case. We want priests who are genuinely called, who are going to be happy and well-rounded in their priesthood. If you do feel that you might have an interest in priesthood, that there is a calling, it has to be a calling, it's not a job. It's a lifestyle, it's a commitment eventually after ordination, but it takes years to get there. Please do feel free to email me or to have a chat on the phone. I'm used to it, and I do get regular inquiries, so don't feel that you're signing your life away to anything. Absolutely no obligation, and I welcome the opportunity to have a chat.